This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by the University of California Press, which has loads of great titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Environmental Justice in a Moment of Danger by Julie Z. We are living in a precarious environmental and political moment. In the United States and in the world, environmental injustices have manifested across racial and class divides in devastatingly disproportionate ways. What does this moment of danger mean for the environment and for justice? What can we learn from environmental justice struggles? Environmental Justice in a Moment of Danger examines mobilizations and movements from protests at Standing Rock to activism in Puerto Rico in the wake of Hurricane Maria. Environmental justice movements fight, survive, love, and create in the face of violence that challenges the conditions of life itself. Exploring dispossession, deregulation, privatization, and inequality, this book is the essential primer on environmental justice, packed with cautiously hopeful stories for the future. Environmental Justice in a Moment of Danger by Julie Z. Out now from University of California Press. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. The protest movement in Hong Kong has subsided, but coronavirus has people panicked and distrustful of a government whose authoritarianism and secrecy have now clearly not only damaged public health, but also further undermined the government's legitimacy. Meanwhile, Hong Kong people continue to fiercely oppose Beijing's efforts to end the one country, two systems order put into place after the UK handed over control to China in 1997. This most recent mass movement was launched last spring in response to a bill that would have allowed for extradition from Hong Kong to mainland China. But it quickly morphed into a larger movement for democracy and against rampant police brutality. This anti-extradition bill movement was built on the 2014 Umbrella Movement, also known as Occupy Central Movement, which was above all else for universal suffrage. What comes next and how the ongoing political crisis surrounding the coronavirus might unfold is uncertain. Today's episode is my interview with writer and activist Au Loong Yu, who spoke to me last week from Hong Kong. He explains the complex social and political economic dynamics behind the 2019 movement, and also the longer history, including the changing relationships between capital and the British colonial and then Chinese states that has shaped the politics and economics of both Hong Kong and China as a whole. He also discusses the history of Hong Kong activists using their relative civil and political liberties to support worker struggles in China, something that the tight grip imposed by President Xi Jinping has made increasingly difficult. But Au says that changing conditions may create new opportunities for bigger change. Critically, he says that such change in the mainland will be necessary for change in Hong Kong. Revolution in one city, he says, is impossible. Before we get started, I just want to say to my American listeners, take every angry, confused, hopeful, giddy, weird, and alienated feeling that has washed over you this week and plow it into hard and determined work to crush Mayor Pete's zombie neoliberalism in New Hampshire and beyond. We are winning. If you haven't started making calls or knocking on doors yet, please get involved with your local DSA chapter or go to berniesanders.com/volunteer. Finally, I want to ask you for your support. This podcast can only be my job, and I can only pay all of the people who help make it possible because you, our listeners, support us at patreon.com/thedig. We also have left-wing books to send you in the mail as a thank you if you contribute $10 or more a month. One of those books is A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal. Another is my own new book, All American Nativism, How the Bipartisan War on Immigrants Explains Politics as We Know It. You might be at the gym right now, driving to or from work, at the grocery store, or doing dishes. And you keep meaning to make a contribution, but keep forgetting. When you get back to your computer, please remember to take a minute and make a contribution at patreon.com/thedig. That's patreon.com/thedig. Speaking of my book, I have a lot of tour dates coming up. Coming sooner than later is Philadelphia, Baltimore, and DC. Philly at the Wooden Shoe on February 24th, and then in Mount Ephraim, New Jersey on the 25th at Gallery 88. DC at Solid State Books on February 26th in conversation with Dara Lind. And then on February 27th at Metro DC DSA's Socialist Night School. And then off to Baltimore on February 28th at Red Emma's in conversation with Christy Thornton. Okay, here's Au Loong Yu, a longtime writer and activist based in Hong Kong. He is the author of China's Rise, Strength and Fragility. He is currently working on a book on the Hong Kong 2019 revolt. Au Loong Yu, welcome to The Dig.
Oh, yes. Good morning. On my side, I'm sorry, yes.
Good evening from me and good morning from you.
Yeah.
Here in the U.S., Hong Kong has been out of the headlines recently after nearly a year of Hong Kong politics being on the front page or close to the front page nearly every day. Is that because the protests have waned, or because here in the U.S. we've been distracted because we have a presidential election, the impeachment, and for a few weeks recently, nearly a war with Iran? What is the current state of the movement and the political conflict?
As far as the anti-extradition bill movement is concerned, I think towards the end of 2019, there's already obvious signs that the movement is receding. With the onset of this coronavirus issue and the pandemic is spreading, the movement is basically no longer what it was half a year ago, especially in terms of these young people's clashing with the police. There was still individual incidents of this kind, but the scale is very, very small. So the movement, as I said, was receding for the moment.
The rapid spread of the coronavirus has led to much of China, including Hong Kong, being put on various degrees of lockdown with different sorts of travel restrictions.
Yeah.
It's also created a bit of a crisis for the Chinese government, exposing its inability to coordinate the necessary response to what has turned out to be a massive public health crisis. How is the coronavirus affecting both everyday life and politics in Hong Kong? And how might its impact affect the larger political dynamic in mainland China and Hong Kong?
In terms of daily life, it is now getting very, very hard. As you may have already known from the news that today's in Hong Kong, there is a short supply of masks and people are in panic. We are not far from the possible scenarios of riot if the shortage doesn't solve in a few days. Because without a mask, then if you go out, you put yourself in great risk. You put others people in great risk. But the problem is here actually there is also a problem of wealth distribution. The government has asked the people not to go out, but for many working people, if they do not work, then they do not have income. That's so simple. Therefore, however bad the situation outside, they have to go out to work. But now the mask, with its prices soaring to absurd level, some of these masks is already tenfold of the prices of what it was previously. And for those really poor working people, they really can't afford to buy masks, even if it is on the sale. So for these people, they are very angry and they are very desperate. Not to say those disabled and senior citizens who still have to go out for food, for visiting doctors, and so on and so forth. So the government is simply irresponsible to tell the people not to go out. They simply does not understand what the working people or what the poor people's lives is. And it leads us to the second issue that you raised, is about the politics. I guess if this mask is evenly distributed across Hong Kong people, there probably is still, it is enough for everyone. But the problem is, yes, firstly, we have still a so-called free market or laissez-faire policy from the Hong Kong government, which means non-intervention at every level, even in the midst of a pandemic. And we are even doing worse than the Macau government, whereas the Macau government using its public power to guarantee that every Macau citizens could buy a minimum numbers of masks every day in commissioned shops. So there's less panic emotions in Macau. But the Hong Kong government simply tell people to go to the free market to buy their own stuff. They do nothing to ease the shortage of supplies. So we have, in the end, that lots of people now do not have a mask when they go out, or they were first forced to stay inside. And this also again leads us to the second issue in politics, is that this government has zero credibility nowadays. No one, even those, including some of the previously pro-Beijing's peoples, now do not believe what the government said. But in a pandemic, this makes situation worse. Is simply because even if what they say is true, but no one believes it. So in the end, there is still a rush for the mask. And if this situation could not be eased, then we will be led to a even worse scenarios of what I said is probably chaos and then riots. And I'm really also concerned about this anti-Chinese mood here. It's getting stronger and stronger as well. So we are in a very dire situation.
In terms of the political implications of this crisis, do you see it playing out in any sort of coordinated way, or do you see it more right now as a more diffuse panic? You've mentioned a few factors. There's the mask shortage, which reflects a broader shortcoming in the healthcare system and an even broader problem in terms of the hoarding of resources by the rich and people's well-being being left to the so-called free market. You mentioned this contradiction between the government telling people to stay home for public health purposes and the contradictory capitalist imperative that they work in order to survive and put food on the table. And then you also talked about the lack of legitimacy and credibility with the people that the government has right now. How do you see this playing out in the short, medium, and perhaps longer term?
In the short terms, as I said, there's a danger of sinking into chaos. I hope this is not the only possible scenario. The government yesterday has guaranteed that, okay, we will deliver 8 million masks very soon. But the problem is, if I have no trust on this government, I don't know, and there's no timeline. When it said very soon, no one knows how soon it is. And in the medium term, I think surely there is a bit of countervailing forces which is now at work to fight this virus. I think it is true that some people has pointed out, and I think it's true that yes, the Chinese government, in terms of medical investment over this virus preventions and researchers, it has been putting a lot of money into this research since 2003's SARS pandemic. So I hope that very soon they could come up with some new treatment, come up with some antibiotics or vaccine and so on. But the problem is there is also true that no one knows when it could be delivered. So the great uncertainty still hang above all of us. So even in the medium terms, if these new treatments or vaccines and so on could not be delivered sooner, then more people will die, and the possibility of a partial chaos turning into a nationwide chaos will be imminent in this situation. That is what is most worrying. As you know already, in China, there is a widespread hostility towards anyone who comes from Wuhan, and it has reached irrational level. And just imagine that in the next several weeks, if there is no new treatment, and death tolls rising, and the present figures of nearly 8,000 patients, if it continues rise to more than 10,000, 15,000, then I think a partial chaos then may turn into a nationwide situation. I hope I'm wrong. Yes, I hope it is not that bad, because all our lives now is at stake. But we must also prepare for the worst. And there is one important element that we have to consider. And this is also actually related to the anti-extradition bill movement. It is the complete degenerations and incompetence of the Communist Party's bureaucracy. It is always my thesis that it is a very interesting phenomenon. The Chinese Communist Party's bureaucracy, that it is highly contradictory. On one hand, it is a terribly effective driving force for modernization. If you look at the Qing dynasty towards the end of its dynasty, yes, it was also trying to modernize China, but it failed. And then it was the turn of the Kuomintang, the KMT regime, and its modernizations program was also failing miserably. But the Chinese Communist Party, for all the fault, apart from all its fault, all its wrongdoings, there is one thing that is different from all other previous regimes, is that yes, it was able to modernize China much, much more effective. But at the same time, in terms of politics, this bureaucracy, this party, was also very pre-modern, to the extent that yes, the leaders demands a kind of loyalty which was pre-modern, which is not only that it turns citizens into all its subjects, but also, even for its bureaucracy, it demands a kind of loyalty which is you just cannot just kneel down before your superiors. You have to kowtow. You can never disagree with your superiors. far up to the highest levels of the political leadership. So in the end, yes, as some Western media has already noted that, yes, all around the leaders at every level, they are all yes men. They never disagree. They never tell the top leader what is actually going on. So we have a government which is so effective in cracking down dissidents and the civil society, but it is absolutely incompetent in fighting the virus or in just warning the people. Come on, you know it is killing people. You have to warn the people about this pandemic is coming. But no, the Western media has already picked up these situations and then, yes, criticize how these absolutisms of Chinese Communist parties is responsible for this pandemic. But to add one more dimension to see this thing even more clearly is that this dimension, I mean, what I said is this pre-modern political culture among the party state. This thing, it is precisely its basic weakness. So basic that it simply have no ability to solve this problem itself. So you see, actually, is in these pandemics where truth is the most valuable thing, but the government, even until today, is still arresting honest people who try to tell the world what is going on. And we already see from the past experience of the Chinese Communist Party that it simply could not really discipline its own bureaucracy. We are seeing a dismantling of social fabrics in every level, in the political level, surely, and also in the moral level. In the political levels, people are some of my friends in mainland China is already making comments. I'm not sure how far it is, but at least this is a topic that needs to be discussed and open debate on. Is that once the Wuhan's pandemics become more widespread, according to my friends who tell me, in the Wuhan government, in the municipal government, at every level, it's just paralyzed. Though some of these bureaucrats, some of the officials actually just run away. Some of these officials, yes, they are still performing their duty, but they don't know what to do. They don't know how to do. Should they keep on crack down on those on news, or should they release it, or should they what should they do? Yes, there is a great chaos since the end of 2018 already. So it is at least in the Wuhan level, and we are talking a city with 10 million population. That in Wuhan, the administrations actually paralyzed. And if luckily this is still a partial situation. But how about nationally speaking? What has the central government has been doing? They only sent in additional medical staffs to Wuhan after the outbreak has broken out for more than a month. Are they really crazy? Shouldn't they move much more quicker? Even in the national level, there is not yet a complete paralyzed or, mostly paralyzed situation. But you can see the total incompetence of this bureaucracy. And actually, 100 years ago, there is already even in Europe, in America, there is a growing public awareness on the problems of how to deal with pandemics. Honesty and truth is so important. I still remember when I was a teen, I read is it Danish? Is the Ibsen's novels about the people's enemy. These things has already been discussed and the lessons drawn 100 years ago in Europe. It is also becomes one of our ingredients of running a modern society. But Chinese Communist Party still try to administer a pandemic with a pre-modern political mindset that whenever there is pandemic, the first thing you do is to suppress it. So this is what we are witnessing the consequences now. So I think this if there is ever any positive things about this pandemic is what? Is that I think this pandemics actually exposed the greatest weakness of the present regime. I think in both sense that firstly, the anti-extradition bill movement has exposed the Communist Party's political agenda is to finish off Hong Kong autonomy altogether. And now with this pandemics, it exposed its own weakness of administering a modern society.
The virus, you're saying, has revealed how Chinese authoritarianism creates a communication problem because there are these layers of bureaucratic yes men and the censorship, and that's all led to a situation where the top can't hear or see what's going on at the bottom, which in the case of the coronavirus has made it difficult to understand and then respond to the public health crisis. To what extent will this create a serious problem where the government will find it more difficult to secure popular consent? Because in the past, of course, there's always speculation on the outside that the Chinese government is entering into some sort of significant legitimacy crisis or governmental crisis. But so far, the Chinese government has been able to withstand extraordinary crises, including its massive response to the economic crisis of 2008. Do you think this will be any different?
With the onset of this pandemics, surely the economic growth will be hard hit. People's economists, among the economist community, there is a strong opinion that for 2020, Chinese economic growth will not exceed 6% and so on and so forth. Yes, so there's going to be problems. Surely the Communist Party's diplomats or economists continues to tone down the crisis by saying that with a 6% growth or even a bit less, still the highest in average, globally speaking. Well, if you just look at the figure itself, yes, this is maybe true. But the problem is we have to bear in mind that one Chinese special feature is that in China, because of the huge population, we need a much higher economic growth than many countries in other parts of the world in order to provide enough jobs to the population. Because in China, the so-called intensity of creating jobs in relation to economic growth is quite low in China because of the fact that, yes, China has been upgrading its industry very, very fast. Whereas 30 years ago, there's still a lot of investments, labor-intensive sectors. With the continuous upgrading of industry, actually there have been more and more capital-intensive investment, which means that there are less jobs creations following these upgradings of industry. So China needs a particularly higher growth rate in order to absorb every year millions of their fresh graduates, and also not to say the 200 million rural migrant workers seeking for jobs and so on. So the situation could be becoming problematic with a slowing down of economic growth. And with this pandemic, that situation, the risk is even higher. And then we come to the second part. Well, Chinese government has rolled out a package giving out, or what the Americans said. Chinese government has been throwing out money from the helicopter to save the economy. In 2008, the central government spent something like 4 billion renminbi. And then, in addition to that, municipal governments also spent billions of dollars to boost the economy. Yes, and then, we didn't suffer long-term crisis as in Europe or in America. But the problem is, for 10 years, this is very clear. The consequence of this 2008 package is a terrible rise in the national debt. Now we have a debt ratios of more than 350% of the GDP, which for a low middle income countries is very, very high. So it actually is narrow down the policies maneuverings of the government, because if it roll out another packages this time with the same kind of scale as the 2008, then the risk of a debt crisis will be even much more higher.
Are you saying that the slowdown in Chinese growth could intersect with the coronavirus pandemic to create a new economic crisis that the Chinese government wouldn't have the same tools that it did a decade ago to respond to?
Yes, it is possible. And surely the problem lies in here that even if they repeat the same policy, this will just create another problem, which means the piling up of the debt. And debt has to be paid someday. In the short term, it may save the economy from a slump, but in the medium terms, it's just creating another problems. So this is what I mean.
I want to return to talking about the last year of politics in Hong Kong. In December, before coronavirus emerged as a major issue, the left-wing Chinese news site Lausanne wrote, quote, "After a year of resistance, everyone is jaded and in a vulnerable emotional state. There doesn't seem to be an obvious way out, and while our position in global politics is being consolidated, it isn't taking form as quickly as we'd like. Peaceful rallies seem to be ineffectual, and frontliners have fought their way to a standstill. The cost of resistance has risen exponentially. We have entered an era where anyone who looks young and is clothed in black may be arbitrarily arrested. Why is it that the movement in Hong Kong reached an impasse when it did?"
Towards September, there was already obvious signs that the movement has reached a bottleneck because it no longer could significantly escalate the battle against the government, and its call for a general strike in early September does not really succeed at all, which is a contrast to the situation in early August. I would say that yes, the climax of this movement is the general strike in the 5th of August. Surely the strike was not able to paralyze all of Hong Kong, but significant section of it was paralyzed, especially the airport. Half of it is paralyzed. And also, yes, transportation is so chaos that the whole day many people couldn't, even if they did not go on strike on its own initiative, they were forced to stay outside of their office actually because of the transport problems, because of the chaos. But when the protesters call for a second general strike in early September, that doesn't work. It was because after the August 5th general strike, which is quite successful, there was very soon retaliations from the Beijing government. The Beijing government hard pressed the Cathay Pacific president, and they were forced to step down.
Of the airline?
Of the airline, yes. And then very soon, the Cathay Pacific management shifted the consequence to their employees by sacking 35 or 36 airlines, the flight attendants. So in the end, it was the employees who bears all the consequences. The Beijing government's the reason has to crack down on the Cathay Pacific employee was simply because on the date of the 5th of August, probably half of the flight attendants of Cathay Pacific went on strike. So the Beijings want to revenge on them. And then from then on, a lot more retaliations has occurred. And was there any effective response from the protest movement? No, none. We can't. For a long time, there is no effective response. They don't know how to do. They don't know what to do to save themselves. So therefore, when the students call for a general strike again in September, it is natural and reasonable to see that there is no real responses from the working people, even if some unions had tried it their best. And then what followed is a very typical situation in many parts of the world's social movement as well, that when the mass struggle was not effective enough to respond to repression and retaliation, and then it receded a bit in its scale and in its mass strike and so on. There, the most advanced part of the movement, the young radicals, begins to come up with an idea of taking even more radical actions to substitute mass mobilization instead. So, from September onwards, there were even more efforts by radical young people to practically force the working people to go on strike by blocking the roads, by paralyzing the railways through throwing different kinds of obstacles and things to the track, so that trains could be stopped. And then it further escalated into November's the two great occupations in two universities. Firstly, in Chinese University, and then followed by the Polytechnic universities. So the Chinese University was occupied for a week, and for the Poly universities even much longer, for several weeks. And the reason that there is heavy clashes at the bridge of the Chinese University, I think here we need to be truthful to ourselves. The reason that there is heavy clashes, I think it is on the 11th and 12th of November, where several thousand students occupy the Chinese University and fight the police, who is trying to take back the number 2 bridge. But here, there are lots of reports from students by saying that, yes, the reason for the conflict is the police try to take over the Chinese University. But here, I think that it is not so clear. This claim is not so clear as it is. Because if the police really wanted to take over the Chinese University, it can easily do that by doubling or tripling their police forces. But I think it is technically not a viable choice for the police. It's because Chinese University is quite big. It is a very big campus, and it is very scattered all throughout the hills. So even if they really broke into Chinese University, they will find it very difficult to track down and arrest all the students or most of the students. And from all the circumstantial evidences, I think the police main target was to take back the number 2 bridge only. Because with the students occupying the number 2 bridge, it means that the students can throw all kinds of objects down to the railways, down to the road, the main roads below. But this will stop all traffics linking up the eastern part of New Territories and Kowloon. So the police has cracked down. I think its tactical goal is to stop the students from being able to throw objects down to the roads only. But anyway, on the students' side, why do they want to occupy the number 2 bridge? It was because of the same reason, that they want to stop traffic going so that they could paralyze the transport of Hong Kong. And then through this, they could make the strike materialized on its own. So this is a I think it is a very controversial tactics because there are also many peoples, working peoples, do not want to go on strike on that day, and do not want transport to be stopped on that day. And if they were late to work, or if they could not able to go to work at all, they were forced to do so. So there were a lot of people, including union peoples, disagree with this tactic. But anyway, the students, they just do what they want to do. So it is a common phenomenon, actually, is worldwide in social movement, yes, that when the mass participation in the movements begins to recede, well, so those radical, most advanced part wants to continue the movement, and they begin to take some tactics which may antagonize the rest of the movement stakeholders.
Why is it that labor unions have not been able to play a more significant role in the protest movement? Has there ever been a strong labor movement in Hong Kong?
Never. That is the problem here. Yeah. So it's actually the August 5th general strike. The trade unions, the so-called Confederation of Trade Unions, to their credit, did enthusiastically embrace the idea and went ahead to organize it. Surely they are not the only organizers. With the help of all peoples in the movement, the general strike was materialized successfully. So they have tried their best. But we must, always bear in mind that the Hong Kong labor movement was always very, very weak. And it is not just organizationally speaking. Surely, in terms of organization, it is also very, very weak. It has, it claims to have a lot of members, hundreds of thousands of members, but regrettably, most of these are just on papers. They're never a real rank and file activisms in the trade union. Never. But this organizational weakness is multiplied by also one political weakness, that the CTU has always politically just tail-ending the pan-democrats, the liberals parties. It is now very clear, and even the pan-democrats leaders sometimes admit their errors, that they have been too timid, too meek in the promotions of democratic movement. They never dare to demand for universal suffrage, not until the handover. So for 20 years, from 1980s until 2000, the liberals parties could only dare to demand for 40 or 50% of the legislature seats to be directly elected. So it was their own failure in meeting up the greatest challenge we ever faced, which means a handover of sovereignty. It was the failure of these liberals to lead Hong Kong peoples out of this terrible crisis. And they are so silly that they trusted the Beijing government that it was going to honor its promises of universal suffrage gradually. So in the end, now for more than 35 years, we don't see any universal suffrage near us. So, but the problem lies in here, that the trade unions has always been faithfully tail-ending the Liberal Party's political line and program. In the end, they totally disconnect themselves from the young generation.
These unions don't even meet basic liberal democratic demands, let alone socialist democratic demands.
No, yeah. Even in the 1990s, the leaders of the Confederation of Trade Unions opposed the idea from some left-wing groups that Hong Kong should have a minimum wage. Yeah, and the leader during the election campaign openly declared that, well, we oppose minimum wage. This is a planned economy idea. This is what he said. So it is, well, to their credit, we must admit that after the handover, the CTU gradually came to their sense and become embracing the minimum wage demands again, and they did a promotion campaign to fight for that. And eventually, because of whatever reason, the government by that time is still a bit more liberal than today's. So the government conceded and imposed a minimum wage in Hong Kong for the first time. So one can still see the basic weakness of these labor unions. So that is also why when the first generation of young people who suddenly come to their senses that yes, that the Beijing will never honor its promise, that it is going to finish off our autonomy altogether very, very soon. So it is the 2014 umbrella generation who rose up and fight hard for the first time for universal suffrage, which is a brilliant act. But they did not have the endorsement of the pan-democrat parties. All the pan-democrat parties came out in opposition to the occupation idea, the Occupy Central idea. Even after the occupation happened, most of the pan-democrat parties, day in and day out, they just try to persuade the students to withdraw from occupation, to give up the occupation. And this really antagonized the young generation. And the CTU unions, in these scenarios, they are all very passive. So disconnect, the umbrella movement, proved that both the liberal parties and the CTUs could really no longer a viable political force which could protect Hong Kong people. And that's pronounced as their downfall. Luckily, in 2019, this time the CTUs was a bit more proactive, and they came out to organize strike and so on, which is helpful to them and helpful to Hong Kong. But still, because this weakness has been rooted, so deep-rooted for so many years, is still unable to give a strong response to this retaliation I talked about. That is why, after the August climax, the labor union could no longer really mobilize to fight back. But surely right now there is also still new openings and new hope, but I will talk about that later.
The protest movement has 5 demands, including universal suffrage, an independent inquiry into police brutality, and amnesty for arrested protesters. But the original demand was to withdraw the extradition bill, and Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam did just that in September. But as Eli Friedman told Jacobin, quote, "Opposition to this bill was the original catalyst for the movement, and many believe that if the bill had been withdrawn in June, the protests would have died down. Unfortunately for the government, their ham-fisted response and brutal repression by the police generated more demands, such that by the time the bill was finally withdrawn in September, people were hardly impressed." Why was extradition to mainland China, why was that the issue that catalyzed this broader, long-standing anger over the forced incorporation of Hong Kong into China and demands for political democracy? And why was that the thing that prompted this mass movement? And then what is the significance of the movement becoming a movement that was also and is also centrally about police repression?
Of course, police brutalities is added fuel to this anger of the people. But I will say there is one more important underlying issue that I will talk about later. First, I respond to the questions of this bill. What is the significance of this bill? Why it was widely opposed? It is obvious that, yes, this bill, when presented by the government or by Beijing, they try to sell this bill by saying that, we only target those mainland fugitives who fled China and hide in Hong Kong, but they have done illegal. But they had done illegal things, so we just go after them through this bill.
It was a particular high-profile murder case that they used, right?
Yes. But I don't go into detail because everyone knows this murder is using this murder as a leverage is simply silly and stupid. It convinces no one. But if they say, but they have a second line of defense, which is what I said, that, well, the bill is to go after Chinese fugitive. But if you read the bill, it is very clear. It targets everyone who happens to be in Hong Kong. Well, even including you, Daniel, if you talks about China's critical tone, and then the Chinese government doesn't like you, and you happen to be in Hong Kong, they could also arrest you under this bill. I mean the Hong Kong government, and then send you back to China for trial. So this is just a lie for Beijing. When they said that the bill just target mainland refugees, mainland fugitive. So it targets everyone, and that makes everyone angry, including the many Western countries' government, because they know their nationals will be put in danger because of this. And for Hong Kong people, surely they know what's going on, because everyone's remember in 2015 the Bookshop 5 incident, which I briefly tell the story about this is that 5 bookshops owners and staffs were actually kidnapped in different ways. At least 2 of them could be proven that they were kidnapped from Hong Kong or from outside Hong Kong, in Thailand, for instance, were kidnapped back to China. And the reason of Beijing doing this is commonly believed that it is because the bookshop has published the books about Xi Jinping's private life. And that's pissed off Beijing.
And the princelings.
Yes, and the princelings and so on, yes. So this extrajudicial kidnap really pissed off Hong Kong people. And they know very well from then on that Hong Kong's autonomy, the so-called one country, two system, is finished. Well, but if Beijing could be a bit more moderate, well, and not rolling out this extradition bill, possibly there is no great protest in 2019, possibly not even this year, because there is deep demoralization after the failures of the umbrella movement. So who revived the protests in Hong Kong? Actually, it's the Beijing themselves. It is the Carrie Lam's governments themselves who trigger off the anger of the people again by rolling out this bill. And this leads us to the second question that we just talked about, that, well, surely in September 4th, Carrie Lam has already announced the official withdrawal of the bill. But the problem is not just police repression that anger the peoples into raising the 5 demands, not one less, so they keep the momentum of the movement going and reach the climax in August. No, not just police brutality. It is also the police collusions with mafia.
The triads.
Yes, which is so obvious in the 21st July's incident. Actually, this is not just one single event. Back in 2014 umbrella movement, all the circumstantial evidence also pointed to a scenario of Beijing and the Hong Kong government colluding with the Hong Kong mafia and calling them out to beat up protesters in Mong Kok already. And for long time China experts, if they really observe the situation for a long time, they must have known this, that the Beijing's policy is to work with those mafia which had announced their loyalty to Beijing, to work with them so that they could be used as a dark force in repressing the people. Actually, 20 years back, the head of the public orders departments in China, when he was interviewed, he already said that, this guy's surname is Tao. This Mr. Tao already said that Well, you can't say all the mafia are bad people. Some of them are patriotic. So everyone knows that if Chinese Communist parties label anyone as patriotic, which means they already be 统战 the names, or they already been co-opted as one of the allies. And since then, various circumstantial evidences or even confession by some mafia head points to this direction, that Beijing was working with mafia long time ago. And then, so you can see in 2014, the mafia beating up protesters. And then in 2019, it's the July 21st incident, which happened in a train stop called Au Loong, where hundreds of mafia just using sticks and beat up anyone who came out from the train indiscriminately, because they think that these people must have came back from a great protest in Central. So they just see them as all are responsible for this protest and physically assault all passengers. And the police at that time, for 39 minutes, did nothing. Even if there are hundreds of calls, thousands of calls to the police to tell them that the mafia is coming out and so on, but they do not respond. And in many events, they just put down their phone. And actually, there are the protesters saw policemen just simply walk by the attack and pretend not to see anything. And when being confronted later, the police officer could not really reply to these questions from reporters. And then a head of the cabinet in the government begged the reporters, please don't ask this question anymore. So you can see there is a huge conspiracy is going on. And this is what pisses off the people here, that they today knows very well that the Communist Party wants to finish off Hong Kong autonomy altogether by extrajudicial kidnapping, by working with mafia, and so on and so forth. So it is not just police brutality which keeps the movement's momentum going on, even after Carrie Lam's announced its withdrawal of the bill.
If the extradition bill, from a strategic perspective, was an overreach on Beijing's part, then why did they do it? What is Beijing's strategy, since they seem to have created mass resistance that they could have easily avoided provoking? What's the imperative driving Beijing's effort to destroy Hong Kong's autonomy? Why do they think that's necessary?
I think there could be several levels of responses to your questions. On the first level, obviously, it was because Xi Jinping's leadership, what was different from the past, was that began to overestimate its strength. We already witnessed that in the trade conflict with U.S. We already witnessed that also in the Huawei case, in the Zhongxin Tongxun case as well. And then in relation to Hong Kong, what is interesting to see is that back 4 or 5 years ago already, there was beginning official discourses from Beijing trying to belittle Hong Kong. They keep on saying that, well, China now, with the China rise, Hong Kong's positive function for China has been declining rapidly. Whereas 30 years ago, Hong Kong's economy equals to 25% of the Chinese GDP. Now, today, maybe just 3-4% or even less. So, this Chinese official discourse conclusion is that, well, Hong Kong is finishing on its own. Hong Kong is no longer important to China. So, forget all about your demand for full autonomy, for universal suffrage and so on. You simply are no longer important to us. Discourse was repeatedly pronounced in the media, in academia, in the political level and so on. But the problem lies in here that this is just half truth. I don't know who is advising Xi Jinping's or their political bureaus on Hong Kong affair. If it is really the Hong Kong and Macau Affair Office people who offer this advice, then they are giving ill advice, because this is not even half truth. This is just maybe 1/10 of the truth. Hong Kong's importance does not lie on just the size of GDP. Just imagine this, that 70% of China's inflow foreign direct investment comes through Hong Kong, and similar proportions of China outward foreign direct investment, or even at least comparable proportion, also goes to Hong Kong. And then just imagine this, that the Chinese corporations also relies on Hong Kong to borrow money, which means corporate debt. And then we also had Hong Kong financial market is one of the top 5 in the world. And actually today, more than 60% of the stock market values belongs to Chinese companies. So in terms of IPO, the floating of Chinese corporations, Hong Kong is the very, very important site of IPO. So Chinese economy in many other areas still relies on Hong Kong very much. And not to say that Hong Kong was treated as separate custom territory. Therefore, Chinese corporations which operate in Hong Kong could receive treatment much better than they were or they are in mainland China, especially including high technology importation. So when the Xi Jinping leadership thought that Hong Kong is no longer important, they made a grave mistake. And then in terms of the bill, I really don't know who is advising the top leaders over the legal issues, because as readers or audience knows as well, extradition thing is very, very complicated. It requires very deep knowledge about legal systems in the world, in other parts of the world, and all the procedures and so on. And Hong Kong is still has the British law in place. And then it is, if the Chinese government really just want to target Chinese mainland fugitive, then it is easy. They can just write the bill to narrow the bill down to just targeting these mainland Chinese. Or, of course, I do not support that. Or if they also want to target Hong Kong people, well, then they could write the bill to the extent that they only target mainland Chinese and Hong Kong Chinese. In this case, the Western government would probably do very little to oppose the bill at all, because the bill doesn't affect them at all. So if legal advisors of the top leaders is a bit more competent, even to their interest, to the bureaucracy's interest, they shouldn't have written the bill in that way. This is a bill that targets everyone, and this will make the world turn against you. That's so simple. So this is exactly what happened. And so, time and again, it leads us back to the conclusion that who is advising Xi Jinping? And lastly, at least in the economic side, there is some reports about the advisors of Xi Jinping, that he was advised by an economist, Mr. Hu, who argued that China, because of its rise, has already been head-to-head and shoulder with the US, which means that China now today is so strong that we can compete with US. If that is true, then, well, I think Xi Jinping has chosen the worst economic advisor he could get. So anyone who have some familiarity with politics knows this very clearly, that if a leader repeatedly choose a silly and stupid advisor, this means that the leader himself, well, probably a man, isn't it, in China, the leader himself will probably be also quite silly. And I think this is a fair comment until, they could give us more openness and tell us the truth.
An article I read by Brian C.H. Fong on the political economic history of Hong Kong was very interesting. And he writes that under British rule, the local Hong Kong government had relative autonomy from Hong Kong capitalists, but that this relative autonomy has been lost under Chinese rule. He writes, quote, "As some neo-Marxists have pointed out, under a capitalist system, the state must serve the interests of the bourgeoisie by facilitating capital accumulation on the one hand, but must also maintain a certain degree of autonomy from the capitalist class on the other. The significance of relative autonomy lies in its strategic importance in enabling the state to pursue a policy agenda broader than the interests of any particular interest group and achieve an appropriate balancing of different interests in society." My question is, what is the significance of Hong Kong's government having lost so much of this autonomy and potentially being set to lose even more under Chinese rule? Does the relative autonomy of local government still nonetheless play an important role for Beijing, whether it realizes it or not, in terms of the need for Hong Kong's legal system to remain independent for the purpose of attracting global capital?
Well, this is a very important question. I agree with the comments that Brian you quoted, but I would like to elaborate a bit more. The British government, they allow quite big economic autonomy and liberty for the local Chinese bourgeoisie from the very beginning. But this is not because of any goodwill, surely, not because of any good intention. It's simply because of one thing, that they already control the most important resources and all the upstream economic power, and then profit from it. They just don't give a shit to those downstreams, less important economic sector at all. The first most important resources that it controlled was the land, through declaring that all Hong Kong land becomes crown land. And then anyone who wanted to do business has to rent or so-called leased from the government. This already gives them huge economic power and get a big profit from it, because they will just hand cheap land to British corporations and to their cronies, while the Chinese has to pay a lot of money to lease the land, both or maybe for living or maybe for doing business and so on. So not to say all the other economic sectors which is very profitable and monopolistic, say the airlines, the buses, the railway, communication, they were all monopolized by British capital. And because of this, they already well-fed. So therefore, they don't mind at all that they allow the local bourgeoisie to make money in those highly competitive and low profit rate sectors, from catering to all these retail sales or the wholesalers or storage, these kind of things. Surely, with the declines of British Empire, the local bourgeoisie also becomes more and more wealthy, and the British capital, have their market shares decline very rapidly, already 30 years before the handover. So this is what benefits the local bourgeoisie. But the problem here is also very obvious, that the local bourgeoisie, so-called autonomy, is chiefly and entirely an economic one. In political terms, it is totally incompetent, totally useless. They could not even form a unified and strong bourgeoisie party. And this is one of the reasons why the Beijing government take direct control today. 35 years ago, when British government negotiates with Beijing over the Hong Kong handover, Deng Xiaoping did hint that yes, we are going to rely on the Hong Kong bourgeoisie to rule Hong Kong. We are not going to have direct control. Well, you may or may not believe his promise, but the issue is still very clear that if the bourgeoisie, with such economic resources, why couldn't they even come up with a strong political party? Precisely because of this complete failure, which allows instead the pro-Beijing party, which means the umbrella organizations of the Communist parties here. This allows the Communist parties to grow. I mean the umbrella organization, to grow into a big political party. Why does this small bourgeoisie liberal party is so uninfluential? It's entirely at the mercy of Beijing. Well, it is because of their failure, and therefore we must distinguish this economic autonomy from its political failure, and this also leads us to the problems why we lost our autonomy so quickly. Well, then we can come to the conclusion that firstly, the complete failure of the bourgeoisie. Secondly, the failure of the labor movement as well. And thirdly, I would say it is the complete failure of the generations of my generation or those who are in the middle 40s generations. It is this complete failure of this older generation which makes the young people now facing all the terrible consequences. And it is they, because they are more sensitive, I call this generation, this new generation, as 97 generation, who were born slightly before or after 97. So this generation was raised and grow up in a terrible era, an era of continuously bad news, of Hong Kong sinking into deeper and deeper trouble, and so on. That explains why they, in desperation, they come up with the last fight, and they really don't even spare their lives. That is why we see these young, angry people. So it is these three levels of factors which lead to the greater movement. And in terms of the governments, the Hong Kong government and the judicial independence, well, of course, the Hong Kong government, my guess is in the top level of the government, probably there is already a Communist Party secret cell in control of everything and connect this to the liaison office.
The liaison office is the Beijing government, the PRC's government representative in Hong Kong.
Yeah. So it's the only thing now is still not really intact, but still not directly controlled by the Communist Party is the legal system. But this is eroding very quickly because of the lack of civil power.
But is there a contradiction there in terms of the PRC government, Xi Jinping's drive for total political and legal absorption of Hong Kong on the one hand, and the key advantages and benefits derived from Hong Kong's separate status on the other? Is there a core contradiction there?
Oh yes, there is of course contradictions, and this is what is also challenging for Beijing, because I think its agenda is the following: they will keep the appearance of one country, two systems intact, but just the appearance. They will hollow out all the Hong Kong's autonomy under the table, secretly. Therefore, I always joke that the Chinese Communist Party should also actually name it as a Chinese Conspiracy Party. But the problem is, to do this requires great skill. Of course, the Chinese government is so good at conspiracy, yes, that only until not until 2014 did its conspiracies exposed. But anyway, eventually still, its hidden agenda now become very, very clear to average Hong Kong people. Therefore, it proves one thing, that eventually the Communist parties failed in its effort to put these two things together, which means on the table, the one country, two systems still there, and under the table is direct control. But the problem is, yes, it did not succeed in that. So I think that, I don't know where did it come from, but also from all these, even from those pro-communist parties report, but those who are not the factions of Xi Jinping. You know, in Hong Kong, there is a daily newspaper called Sing Pao. It is a very weird newspaper. It was run by Chinese merchants, but it was also very, very critical of the Hong Kong Macau Affair Office, to the extent that they claim that the Hong Kong independent movement was just an invention by the Hong Kong Macau Affair Office to appease the top leaders. So, combining all these kind of strange reports, circumstantial evidence, many people believe, and I also believe, that inside the Communist Party, I don't know whom, inside the Communist Party there was a dark force which now today try to take direct control of Hong Kong by whatever means. They don't care about the appearance of one country, two system anymore. They don't care how people see it. And in many sense, and that's also explained that why there were so many radical actions. It is very clear now that in the half year's protest movement, some of these petrol bombs, some of these burning of these of shops and so on, are actually done by undercover or plainclothes. Who are they? Nobody knows. Some may be police, some may be not. But I would describe this as a kind of dark force from the Communist Party who is intentionally putting Hong Kong into chaos.
This is Sarah Jaffe, and you are listening to The Dig with Daniel Denver, my favorite podcast for thoughtful discussions on the U.S. left and beyond, and you can support it on patreon.com.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com, and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Organized Labor and the Black Worker, 1619 to 1981, by Philip Foner, with a new introduction by Robin D.G. Kelly. In this classic account, historian Philip Foner traces the radical history of black workers' contribution to the American labor movement. Philip S. Foner was a prolific people's historian, whose many works include The Black Panthers Speak, Clara Zetkin Selected Writings, and The Letters of Joe Hill, all published in new editions by Haymarket Books. The Black Scholar says of this book, Foner's careful and detailed scholarship makes this the best one-volume study of blacks and the labor movement currently available. Organized Labor and the Black Worker by Philip Foner, with a new introduction by Robin D.G. Kelly, out now from Haymarket Books. Stepping back to something that we touched on a few minutes back, some of this historical context that I think is very important and that a lot of listeners here might not know about. In the transition to Chinese rule, why did both the Chinese state and Hong Kong capitalists see an alliance as in their interest, this governing alliance? And why did both see popular democratic rule as a threat?
Well, it's easy to explain. It's because Beijing easily co-opted the Hong Kong bourgeoisie by allowing them to invest in China from the very beginning.
And this fit into Deng Xiaoping's broader agenda of remaking Chinese political economy into the global manufacturing juggernaut that we know today.
Yes, and actually, everyone knows that without the Chinese market, Hong Kong will not be so quickly evolve into a huge financial center. And this Hong Kong bourgeoisie will not get that rich at all. So it's something like similar to Taiwan, that a huge sections of the Taiwan bourgeoisie was being co-opted by Beijing as well. Therefore, this is just reasonable and natural for the Hong Kong bourgeoisie to ally with Beijing. And surely, the Hong Kong bourgeoisie fear of Hong Kong people having democratic rights, then they fear Beijing. This is hardened position from the very beginning.
Even with this alliance between the authoritarian Chinese state, the Hong Kong government, and Hong Kong capitalists has proven disastrous for ordinary people. Hong Kong is a city with incredible inequality that's faced massive deindustrialization in recent decades, downward mobility, and a severe housing crisis that forces many people to live in nano apartments that are smaller than a single parking space. But nonetheless, the protest movement has not, by and large, targeted this concentration of economic power and its ties to the state, even given that it's created this incredibly difficult economic situation. And even though they're protesting the state part of that state business alliance, why are protester demands, and I want to clarify that the demands are clearly just demands, but why are they articulated in such narrowly political terms, in liberal terms?
I think here is require a multi-level responses to this question because it's a bit complicated. Firstly, yes, there are only 5 demands. There is no demands targeting inequality or labor rights and so on. And even the unions doesn't care about raising this. Actually, some of my younger friends has tried to raise this through online discussion, but they did not succeed at all. Nobody cares because nobody cares about raising progressive tax and so as to fund welfare, more welfare. Nobody cares about this demand at all.
Even though people's situation economically is quite dire.
Well, I think here must be heavily qualified. Daniel, here is important. This is what I wanted to say. Firstly, on one hand, it's obvious that it is the young people who take the lead in this movement. And for thousands and thousands of these young people, they are witnessing, they feel, and they are quite right too. They are witnessing an imminent fall of Hong Kong. If we are not saving this, come out to save Hong Kong, then all our rights will be gone very soon. Half a year, 1 year, or whatever. So they see this as a last fight, as a last battle. And that's also explained why there are also so many suicide cases as well. They see saving Hong Kong autonomy is the priority. Yeah? So it should take priority above everything else. And anything which could divide the movement should be posed later, not now. That is the sentiment. And secondly, more importantly, is that even a lot of Hong Kong working people does not feel that urgent to raise a labor rights issue at all. And here is very important. I find that many Western media is sometimes misleading when they present Hong Kong's economic problems. Surely, the inequality is very big. The Gini coefficients 3 years back, what I remember is something like 0.55, something like that. So it is, of course, in terms of inequality, is very significant. But there is one thing that is often lost in the Western media presentation, is that we still had a semi-welfare state. Half of the population still lives in public housing.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yes, exactly. Because we copied that from Britain since the 1970s. So, actually, I also live in a government-subsidized apartment, which I paid a very little amount of money. Then I own an apartment. Yes, this is crazy that now today's a small apartment will cost you 4 million Hong Kong dollars. This is absolute crazy, and this drives people mad. Yes, but this is just a very recent situation. It is just a situation persisting for less than 10 years, and still the government is expanding public housing. It's still falls short of demand. Yes, it is true. But if you are a poor working family and you apply for a public housing, and the government tells you that, okay, wait for 5 years, and then you wait, okay? Or sometimes it's extended, 6 years, yes, and can you wait? Will you take radical actions to fight for a house which will be given to you in 5 years or 6 years? Surely you will wait, right? So public housing is a great social stabilizer for Hong Kong. Without this, yes, Hong Kong will have huge protest movement long time ago. And this public housing, this legacy of the colonial government is a good one for its own administration as well, actually. So, and also we have accessible medical care for everyone. There is no screening of being able to be treated in hospitals. It is far from ideal, our medical care. But I would say it's much better than you American. And actually, I have friends who already, Hong Kong's immigrants is everywhere. I have friends in America whose mother constantly returning to Hong Kong to be treated in hospitals because in America it's too expensive. So we have, I will describe this as semi-welfare state. We don't have a good pension. We don't have unemployment benefit until recently, because Carrie Lam just announced that they will going to have some kind of a watered down versions of unemployment benefit. But yes, for until now we don't have one. But the problem is Hong Kong has been a prosperous society for so long that the unemployment rate is always single digit. And most of the time is just 3 or 4%, which will be considered by economists as just frictional.
As full employment.
Yeah, that's really, this is really full employment. So we have nasty jobs, we have very bad jobs, we have very low paid jobs, but we have jobs. And this keep people going. And especially for generation over 30 years ago, usually they enjoy, a relative upward mobility. If they are poor, they could eligible for public housing. And that's why it is not uncommon to see working family own an apartment, have considerable amount of savings for people who are over 35, say, for instance. So, and therefore, we have a huge middle class as well. So the situation is not as dire as certain Western media try to paint. I don't want to go into detail what is the intention and what is their blindness, what is their blind spot, what have they missed, and so on. But what I want to try to say is that why the people, even among working people, they don't feel targeting inequality that urgent. It's because the situation is really not that urgent. Of course, for the young people, their chances are much less today. Yeah, but, well, this is just a recent situation. And of course, it is regrettable that young people, especially students, they do not have any good perspectives on the working people. They do not know certain, well, we still have a 1.4 million people who are living below poverty lines. But we have very, very little homeless in Hong Kong. Any visitors who have been to any parts of the other world and they come to see Hong Kong, one thing is striking, that you don't find so much homeless. There may be several hundred, but largely they are homeless is because of other reasons, because of the government do
mental health.
Yeah. So yeah, it's mental health problems. Yeah.
I want to run two other perspectives by you and get your response to them on the relationship between the economic situation and the politics. One perspective I have two examples of. One was Toby Carroll, who wrote, quote, "A pull yourself up by the bootstraps individualism prevails in Hong Kong." And then I read an article in Lausanne that said, quote, "Hong Kong's biggest problem is that many people think Hong Kong has no problems. Hong Kong has always prioritized economic growth above all. It is utilitarian to a fault. Since learning your first words, every step you take has been driven by the goal of enhancing your competitive edge, getting ahead, and establishing your personal reputation and legacy." What do you make of that analysis, that there's a degree, I hear what you're saying about the welfare state stabilizing class conflict, but do you think there's a degree of ideological hegemony at play as well?
Oh, yes. Yes, I have been observing this for many years. This is deeply in our blood. That is the problem. I think it is comparable to some extent to certain sections of the American population. You know? Yes. This idea of frontier man, huh? Self-made. Yep. Self-reliance. Yep. Yes. Minimum government. Yeah. Everyone for himself and God for us all. But in America, this kind of idea is shared not by the whole population, just by some sections of the population. But in Hong Kong, it is across all classes. Everyone believes in laissez-faire. Everyone believes in self-made. And if you fail, it is because you are incompetent. That is the dominant ideology. Surely, the whole colonial governments in the past, the whole ruling class, even the middle class, even the intellectuals, I would say they are all accomplices of this cultural hegemony, which is regrettable. But at the same time, there is also one more fundamental element at play, which is the Hong Kong's special situation in the histories of contemporary China. Because whenever, for the past 150 years, whenever there was war, chaos, starvation in mainland China, the southern part of Chinese people, luckily, they still have a Hong Kong to flee to. So Hong Kong is a city, not just as a colony. Hong Kong is a refugee city from the very beginning. It has a very strong refugee political culture, which means this is exactly what I said before, that everyone for himself. Because, and this refugee mentality actually evolved and upgraded in the late 1980s, after the Tiananmen massacre, that the huge middle class, when they saw this massacre, surely they were scared. But their response is phenomenal. The response is not to stay in Hong Kong to fight against both the colonial governments and Beijing. No, they choose a more easy way to flee. This time not as refugee, but as, well-off immigrants to Canada, to America, to all parts of the world, chiefly Western countries, and so on. And what is more phenomenal, what is more ironical, actually, is after the Tiananmen massacre, in early 1990s, the Liberal Party's main concern, the so-called pan-democrats, their main concern is was to promote a campaign to petition the British government to grant a right of abode to Hong Kong people. So, these liberal parties, on one hand, they talk about democratic movement. On the other hand, their main concern is to flee. This is I would say this is a refugee mentality 2.0 version.
Another factor, it seems, is that the PRC government, Beijing, has tried to use the city's economic problems against the political demands and say that there actually is no political problem, just an economic problem. which can make the people arguing for economic justice seem like they're playing into Beijing's ploy, which is ironic. There's something ironic there because Beijing is insisting that the problem is narrowly economic, and then protesters are arguing that the problem is narrowly political, when the reality is that that Hong Kong's governed by an alliance between business and the authoritarian state.
Yes, the Beijing response is stupid and silly. It's just an attempt to iterate its policy, which is just like what they did in China. The Chinese people. The Chinese peoples are allowed to do business, to pursue your economic success. But all civic power, all political power, will be monopolized by the party, and you, the Chinese common people, have no one single stake in it. You are simply not stakeholder at all. And they just trying to implement the same thing in Hong Kong. So they try to frame the discourse as purely economic, which hardly convincing to any sensible person, isn't it? So it's not going to convince anyone. It is just a discourse which literally recognizing that we, the Communist parties, will never share any kind of political power with the common citizens. And then, of course, on the side of the movement, it is regrettable that it goes to another extreme, actually. So actually, they kind of mirror each other, that the protesters see Hong Kong issue right now is just a political one. But here, it's different from the Beijing case. Whereas the Beijing camp is highly unified in this philosophy. In this, I will describe this as an absolutist political philosophy. But in the movement, there are still strong undercurrent, which is different from from the 5 demands. If you read different surveys on the movement, actually, in most of these surveys, if the respondents are being asked, do you think that Hong Kong's inequality is too much to bear? Actually, most people will say yes. And most people will say that, yes, they do concern about the hard lives in Hong Kong, especially for young people. The problem is, in order for this undercurrent to voice out, it requires a left-wing party. But for the past 40 years, because of the worldwide declines of left-wing, there is no real left forces in Hong Kong. So there is no political representatives of this undercurrent. And that is why we have a protest movement which entirely targets political issues. But if give them more chance, give them more time, and with a little bit of push, it is possible to promote a growth of a left-wing voice eventually. Of course, it is not something short-term could be done.
Has the power of the left been undermined by its contradictory role in Hong Kong under the years? After all, under much of British rule, the Hong Kong left supported the Chinese Communist Party against the anti-communists of the KMT, but now it opposes a communist party that runs an unabashedly authoritarian, unabashedly capitalist state.
Deep degenerations of the Communist parties surely totally discredit socialism, communism, or even revolution. The term revolution is a bad word for a long time in Hong Kong. So it's very hard for the genuine left to really grow. In the early 1970s, there is a thin layers of young leftists influenced by the worldwide youth radicalization at that time. that they were doomed. They have no chance to grow at all. Though surely they have their own weakness. I was part of that generation. But there's lots of weakness and also too much immature and so on. But eventually, I think we stand no chance. It's precisely socialism is so much discredited by the Communist Party. And in the 70s, in the 80s, especially when the Hong Kong economy was experiencing a huge boom for so many years, that it was even to criticize capitalism. If you talk about inequality, you will be laughed at, not to say about revolution. So it's very hard situations for the left, and therefore those small left organizations nearly totally marginalized throughout the 80s and 90s and down to the 20s. Only, 21st century. The situation only experienced a little bit of change in 2010 when there was a thin layers of young people who are leaning to the left. But 10 years passed, I think they built nothing. So it is very, very hard situations for the left.
You recently said, quote, Hong Kong is ruled not by its autonomous government, but first and foremost by Beijing, and this absolute asymmetry of forces between the city and the Chinese state make any sensible person to rethink the idea of a revolution within one city. Hong Kong can only win when mainland China is also ready for a mass upheaval, yet this is not in sight. That's a very powerful analysis, sobering. China is a massive country, and it has shown an incredible capacity to successfully repress serious resistance in particular regions like Xinjiang and Tibet that make up a relatively tiny portion of the nation as a whole. Given this dynamic, what is the way out for Hong Kong? Because the same autonomy enjoyed by Hong Kong that has allowed for this protest movement is also what has meant that it's separate from the huge mass of mainland China.
This is the greatest challenge for the Hong Kong democratic movement. The only way out, as I see it, is unless the Hong Kong movement develop a strategies of allying with mainland Chinese social movement. Until then, I don't think that there is any real probabilities of having a successful revolution in Hong Kong alone. Yeah, and of course, during the height of the movement last year, we saw a fundamental change in the people's attitude. Previously, no significant sections of the population will accept fighting with the police or throwing petrol bombs and so on against the police. This is unimaginable even 2 years back. But what makes this movement significant was not just the young people today are there to do this now, but the fact that hundreds and thousands of common citizens actually sympathize with them, help the young people in various ways to do this. And whenever there is big march and then people saw those black blocs marching across the street, they all clap their hands and applaud them and so on. So by that time, I wrote about this, that to make a successful revolution in Hong Kong is quite unlikely, quite impossible actually. But it is possible that if the anger of common people has reached a point that they care no more, that they are so angry that they join the young people in fighting the police, and well, if there were not just a few thousands but hundreds of thousands of people fighting the police, and no police force can really stop it. But that is possible. which means a revolutionary situation is possible. Because what makes revolutionary situation possible is just one thing, because people get so angry. They don't care no more. They don't care even their lives. So they will. So they join the uprising. Of course, this revolutionary situation, if ever happen, will end in tragedy. There's no doubt about it. If if there is no change in Chinese situation. So, but in some way, I hate to say that, but luckily, most people, although they very sympathetic to the so-called valiant, the frontline people, these radical youth, they are sympathize with them, they support them in many, many ways, but they refrain from actually joining them. And I think I wrote what you quote precisely after this kind of observation for several months, that I myself witnessed, that the people have grave reservation to actually join the uprising. Yeah, they never cross the line, actually. And it is easy to understand because they are not stupid. They do not have sophisticated analyzers, but they immediately know that right in the heart of center, there are 8,000 People's Liberation Army stationed in Central.
And more in Shenzhen.
Exactly. So we stand no chance at all. And everyone knows that. Only the young people don't know that. And so, luckily, we didn't enter into a revolutionary situation, because I don't think it is the Chinese China is ripe for a huge revolt right now. But we have to make use of this, the calming down of the protest, to use this period as a rethinking process, to think about our strategy. The problem with this movement is we have a lot of tactics, but we have no strategy. And if there is ever strategy, it is calling for independence, which is self-suicidal. The best strategy for us is to call for self-determination for Hong Kong, but also call for self-determination for all Chinese ethnic minorities, and also for all provinces and cities, and to fight against these Communist Party dynasties in Beijing, which means a strategic alliance between China and Hong Kong Democratic Movement. But we have to be patient, and we have to use all our leverages to help China's social movements to rise up. This is, of course, very, very difficult.
Eli Friedman recently commented about just this in an interview with Jacobin, in terms of the difficulty of building these links between Hong Kong and mainland Chinese workers. He wrote, quote, "This work is made all the more challenging by the fact that links with worker movements in mainland China are basically non-existent. Hong Kong activists have played a critical role in the development of worker organizations and insurgency in China over the past 25 years, but these links are badly attenuated today. This is due to the CCP, the Communist Party of China's, unrelenting effort to smash independent forms of worker organization since 2015, including even the tamest NGOs. Receiving money or assistance from Hong Kong is, in and of itself, risky. To what extent did this relative civil and political freedom in Hong Kong allow for activists to use the city as a launching pad for independent worker organizing in China? And what has Xi's crackdown meant for those cross-border networks?
Firstly, I think, yes, the crackdown on this network is very real. But as far as I know, it is not 100%. There is still collaborations, although in a much more hidden and sophisticated way. This kind of collaboration is still going on. Surely, it is just a fraction of what had been in the past. But still, it is not 100% crackdown. So there's firstly. And secondly, I think we should avoid an approach of previously being overly optimistic, and then under the repression right now, turns to the other extremes of overly pessimistic. I think the situation is very complicated. It is not optimistic, but it is not that pessimistic. It is because of one thing, that the 30 years of so-called open and reform also included a positive side, that there is a huge growth of civil society in China. Although it is largely liberal-led, but, and yes, I assure you, in China, many liberals are actually neoliberals. But we should not dismiss all these forces in one hand as totally, entirely reactionary. It's not that simple. It's very complicated and contradictory. I would say that, yes, in certain ways, among people who are over 30s and so on, who has experienced relative only, but still relatively liberal regime in the 90s and in the 2000s, that people could have access to huge volumes of translations, all kinds of books from other parts of the world, the developments of the cross-border collaboration between NGOs, between academia. This force is small, but it exists, and it can grow when Chinese crisis deepens, and it is exactly what we are facing. Of course, it's still very, very difficult, but that is why patience is required, and of course, wisdom is also required. And that was why I do not agree with the Jiaxing case, where certain radical students tried to use the case of a small strike to elevate it into an all-out offensive against the party state, which I think is premature, and actually they suffered all the consequences. But back to the original...
That's the JASIC?
Yeah, the JASIC, JASIC, yeah. The JASIC case, you can check it online. But anyway... Which
was supported by communist students and led to...
Yes.
Was met with massive repression.
Yes. But they could avoid that, actually. Yes, and that's why the old Maoists split with this young radical now, and they accuse each other. Yeah, I'm not going to judge on this case, but I mean that this case proved that patience is required. But precisely because that the fruit of the past was still there. I mean, the progressive force. It is not in organized form, but it's there. So, in the sight of these great pandemics, it proves one thing, that the Communist Party is successful in, yes, cracking down any kinds of opposition, even in the near future. This is obvious. But at the same time, it could not stop itself from turning into a chaotic source as well. Just like the 2,000 years of histories of the dynastic empire China, actually, in the end, it is not because of the people revolt which makes the dynasty downfall. It is the complete degeneration of the bureaucracy. After it's privatizing all the civic power in its own hands, it gets so corrupted that it simply lacked the power, lacked the strength to discipline itself. All the discipline the center took, these are just token one. It can't stop corruptions going on. It can't stop stealings of state and private sector's properties from happening. It couldn't stop its incompetence, and so on and so forth. So the Communist Party will punish itself, and this is what is happening. Surely, there will be a lot of side effects. The people will suffer, and this is in some way inevitable. But this also means one thing, that the grave crisis may trigger even more factional fights at the top level. Right now, we hear nothing. We don't know. But from all the circumstantial evidence, again, that these internal contradictions has never halted in the past. There is a funny saying I heard from some of my friends that, well, do you know that in the 8 hours work of a top officials, what are they doing? Well, half of the time they will involve in all kinds of internal fight, and then the other half of the times they will entertain themselves in whatever way.
The conflict in Hong Kong has, of course, been swept up into this larger geopolitical and trade conflict between China and the U.S. While the U.S. has sought to leverage the protests for its own purposes against China, China has accused foreign plots of being behind the protests, and then some protesters have praised Donald Trump for supporting them. What's your assessment of how these local politics have been leveraged by competing powers at the global level, and what opportunities and dangers does that pose for the movement? And then finally, how should we on the Western left be in solidarity with Hong Kong and recognize that China can also be an imperial power, but without playing into these reactionary forces here in the United States that seek economic and military conflict with China?
Yeah, this is a big question. Yeah. Firstly, it's about the wavings of American flag. This phenomena is very complicated. Surely, from the very beginning, there were right-wing localists who is very pro-America. They would like to see this thing happen, or they themselves are promoting this. But one must bear in mind that the right-wing localist, organizationally speaking, is very, very small. It simply does not have the institutional muscle or organizational muscle to rally the hundreds of thousands of people on their own. But why were there so many American flags being waved? But actually, if as a local, you can see in many protests that not just American flags were waved. Surely, American flags was the most popular, but you can see actually multiple flags. You can see, the German flags, British flags, all kinds of European countries' flags, a lot of Catalonia flags actually as well, even Japanese flag, Taiwan flags, and so on. And when ordinary people who waved the American flags or all of these kind of flags, they have a different meaning from those die-hard right-wing localists. If you talk to the young people or those who are waving these flags, most of the time, why you wave this flag? Do you think America is really a very democratic one? Or are you pro-Trump? Actually, this is not the way people think mostly. They wave it is because they want to reassert one thing, that Hong Kong is an international city. It's a metropolitan. It is not a regular mainland Chinese city. This is a city which enjoys autonomy and also a broad international connection, especially economically, especially in economies and in culture, in everything, even if it is not in politics. So these wavings of different kinds of flags has different meaning from different people. This is one dimension that we have to bear in mind. And we must also understand one thing, that in Hong Kong, all parties are very, very weak. No democratic party or localist parties has at most has several hundred or just several dozens of membership. Even the biggest party, which is Democratic Party, they only claim 700 members. So we have 2 million people took to the street. So most of these people are just very ordinary citizens who are not that political in the first place. therefore, even if it is a bit, I think it is embarrassing to see the American flag waving around, but the political meaning is not what many foreign observers thought it is. And secondly, surely there are the pan-democrats, organizationally very weak, but they do enjoy two main forces support. One is the Apple Daily, which is a very pro-American, very pro-neoliberal popular media. It is actually just a tabloid, but it is a so-called pan-democrat tabloid. It is regrettable to see this, but it is the fact. And secondly, the liberals here enjoy a great number of academia support. And these two forces themselves are often also very pro-America. That is the problem. So when the American or Trump stress that they did not intervene in any ways in this movement, I believe it's true because they don't need that. They don't need those open intervention. They don't need really paying money. We are a rich city. The pan-democrats has a foundation to support the movement, legal cases or humanity support and so on. They raise more than $100 million on their own. We don't need to be subsidized by the American empire. This is the most silly accusation. America do not need this kind of low-level intervention. They only need to give them media privileges. They only need to, continuously to quote from Apple Daily or to quote from pro-Americans academia. Then they could do the job. Not to say that the pan-democrat themselves has a lot of link with the American establishment. So they could intervene just by talking. So to make sure to have a clear picture of this so-called American intervention is important, which means that if the movement sometimes exhibits a very problematic position, waving of flag, calling for Trump to pass the bills on Hong Kong human rights and so on, this is, I will not say is 100% of course, but there is a heavy doses of spontaneities in the movement as well. So we have to come back with those right-wing forces or pro-American forces. We have to make sure that we target the right target. So here, for instance, especially on your question about how American peoples or the progressive peoples help in this battle for Hong Kong autonomy, I think one important thing is to give concrete analysis and concrete support or criticism. Say, for instance, the Hong Kong's Human Rights Act. We have launched a statement and endorsed by 20 organizations from Americas and Hong Kong, criticizing the human rights bills. The tones of this statement is not a abstract rejection of everything the American Congress doing. We give a concrete analysis on the bill and pointed out that it's actually tie American foreign policy, including on Iran and North Korea, to Hong Kong human rights, and that is unacceptable. And I think this kind of concrete analysis and critique is more easy to allow people, both in Hong Kong and in America, to understand what's wrong with the bill. We are demanding that if the American government or the Congress is sincere with its support of Hong Kong democracy, then it should at least do what they have done in the 1980s, in 1986. The Congress at that time, you know very well of this too, that has passed the law on sanctioning the South Africans' apartheid regime, and by that time the law does not mention anything about American policy. It is all in all, it is about sanctioning the South African apartheid. And this bill by that time was supported by many American left and trade unions and progressives. So I think it is a bit sad to see that there in America, there is not much serious and constructive criticisms over this Hong Kong human rights bills. So I think, of course, there is deep roots to this problem. It is because between Hong Kong people or Chinese people in general and the American progressive leftists and so on, there are rarely any chances of exchange. We are talking not just with different languages, we are talking with different perspective. And this is why sometimes it is hard to talk to each other. So it is very important that, yes, from now on, there is more exchange and mutual understandings on both sides. Without this, I think it is hard to have genuine understanding on each side.
Well, Au Loong Yu, thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Au Loong Yu is a longtime writer and activist based in Hong Kong. He is the author of China's Rise, Strength and Fragility, and he is currently working on a book on the Hong Kong 2019 revolt. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that proletarian revolutions, like those of the 19th century, criticize themselves constantly. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We are posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis, music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinators are Julia Rock and Zachary Nin. Our senior advisor is Thea Riofrancos. Special thanks this episode to all the help provided by Eli Friedman. Check out our vast archives at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter at thedigradio, and please do find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe. If it's on iTunes or wherever else, please do leave us a nice review. Take a moment to do that because ostensibly that introduces us to new listeners, which is good. But what really does that is you telling people that you know about the show and why you like it and suggesting that they listen to it. Please make propaganda for us. And do take a moment to find us at patreon.com and make a monthly contribution to keep this operation going strong. Even a few bucks a month is a big help.